Picture this. You're 17 years old, standing in your family's courtyard as your mother adjusts your ceremonial peplos with trembling fingers. The morning sun catches the golden threads woven through the fabric, and everyone tells you how radiant you look. Your father speaks proudly of the alliance this marriage will create. Your aunts whisper about the beautiful children you'll bear. But there's something in your mother's eyes that doesn't match her smile. Something that makes your stomach twist with unease. She keeps glancing toward the house where you'll spend tonight, and every time she does, her hands shake just a little more. What you don't know yet is that Greek marriage ceremonies had two faces: the public celebration everyone could see, and the private ritual that would happen after sunset. A ritual so disturbing that later generations would spend centuries trying to pretend it never existed at all. By the time the sun sets on your wedding day, you'll understand why your mother couldn't meet your eyes this morning. You'll learn why Greek women rarely spoke about their wedding nights, even to their own daughters. And you'll discover that what awaited you behind closed doors wasn't about love or even consummation. It was about something far more sinister. This isn't mythology or legend. This was reality in ancient Greece. A practice so deeply embedded in their culture that it survived for generations, witnessed by thousands, yet deliberately erased from history by those who came after. What happened to Greek brides on their wedding nights was documented by ancient writers who were horrified enough to record it, but careful enough to speak in whispers and coded language. The evidence they left behind tells a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient Greek civilization. Today, we're going to uncover the truth about Greek marriage rituals. We're going to explore archaeological evidence that scholars have tried to downplay for decades. We're going to examine testimony from ancient sources who couldn't bring themselves to describe these ceremonies directly. And we're going to understand why an entire civilization worked so hard to bury this aspect of their culture that it nearly disappeared from historical record entirely. But before we dive into the darkness of what actually happened behind those closed doors, we need to understand how we even know about these rituals at all. Because the evidence wasn't meant to survive. It was meant to be forgotten. The first clues came from an unexpected source. In the late 19th century, archaeologists working near Athens discovered a sealed chamber beneath what appeared to be an ordinary residential foundation. Inside, they found something that made no sense at the time. Dozens of small clay tablets covered in what looked like wedding prayers, but the language was wrong. The words were too explicit, too clinical, too focused on physical examination and verification rather than celebration or blessing. For decades, scholars assumed these were forgeries, or perhaps religious texts from some obscure fertility cult. The tablets were quietly stored away in museum basements, deemed too inappropriate for public display. It wasn't until the 1960s that researchers began to piece together their true significance. These weren't random religious artifacts. They were instruction manuals, step-by-step guides for conducting marriage verification ceremonies, and they matched references found scattered throughout ancient Greek literature, references that earlier scholars had dismissed as metaphorical or symbolic. The picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. Ancient Greek marriage wasn't just a social contract or religious ceremony. It was a legal transaction that required physical proof, witnessed documentation, and medical verification. And the process of obtaining that proof involved rituals that would be considered criminal by modern standards. To understand why these ceremonies existed, you have to understand what marriage meant in ancient Greek society. It wasn't about romantic love or personal choice. It was about property transfer, bloodline verification, and political alliance. A Greek father wasn't giving his daughter to a husband so much as he was transferring ownership of her reproductive capacity. And like any valuable property transaction, this transfer required authentication. Think about how Greeks handled other important contracts. When land changed hands, surveyors examined every boundary. When livestock was sold, veterinarians confirmed the animal's health and breeding capacity. When citizenship was granted, officials verified genealogy and legal standing. Nothing was taken on faith. Everything was documented, witnessed, and proven. Marriage followed the same logic, with one crucial difference. The property being transferred was a human being, and the asset being verified was her body's capacity to produce legitimate heirs. This is where the wedding night rituals came into play. They weren't celebrations or romantic interludes. They were verification procedures conducted with the same clinical precision Greeks applied to any other legal documentation. And they were witnessed, recorded, and sworn to by people whose testimony could later be demanded in court if the marriage's legitimacy was ever challenged. The process began hours before sunset on the wedding day itself. While the public festivities continued in the courtyard, a different kind of preparation was taking place inside the house. The bride was taken to a special chamber where she would undergo what ancient texts euphemistically called readiness confirmation. This involved a physical examination conducted by an experienced matron, usually the groom's mother or another female relative of high standing. But this examination wasn't just about confirming virginity, though that was certainly part of it. The documents found in those sealed chambers describe a more comprehensive process. The bride's overall health was assessed. Her physical development was evaluated. Any potential impediments to childbearing were documented. The examining matron would create what amounted to a medical report, noting everything from the bride's height and weight to more intimate anatomical details that determined her suitability for immediate conception. This report was then sealed and witnessed by several people, creating a legal record that could be referenced later if questions arose about the legitimacy of any children produced by the marriage. The Greeks were obsessively concerned with bloodline purity, and they developed elaborate systems to ensure that no questions could later be raised about a child's parentage or inheritance rights. While this examination was taking place, another preparation was underway in a different part of the house. The marriage chamber was being arranged according to specific ritual requirements that varied depending on the region and the families involved, but certain elements appeared consistently across different Greek communities. Burning oil lamps were positioned to provide clear illumination throughout the night. Multiple witnesses, usually older women from both families, were assigned specific viewing positions. And most disturbing of all, religious artifacts were brought into the room that served purposes having nothing to do with blessing or protection. The most common of these artifacts was a wooden figure representing Priapus, the god of fertility and masculine power. But unlike the small household shrines or garden decorations modern people might imagine, these ceremonial figures were life-sized and anatomically explicit. They served a specific ritual purpose that becomes clear only when you read the ancient instructions for their use. According to the clay tablets found near Athens, the bride was required to perform what was called divine introduction with the figure before her husband was permitted to approach. The exact details of this ritual were considered so sacred that they were never written down in plain language, only described through elaborate metaphors and religious symbolism. But when you piece together references from multiple sources, a disturbing picture emerges of a ceremony designed to break down psychological resistance and establish absolute submission. The bride, already weakened by hours of examination and preparation, would be led to the figure by the senior matron overseeing the ceremony. She would be instructed to demonstrate her acceptance of her new role through physical interaction with the wooden representation. The witnesses would observe and later swear that the ritual had been completed according to ancestral custom. Only then would the actual consummation begin, with those same witnesses remaining present throughout. Modern historians have struggled with how to interpret these accounts. Some have suggested that the rituals were purely symbolic, that the references to physical interaction were metaphorical rather than literal. Others have proposed that the ceremonies evolved over time, becoming less extreme in later periods. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. The wooden figures found in excavated marriage chambers show clear signs of repeated use. Chemical analysis has revealed biological materials that confirm these weren't mere decorative objects. More importantly, the consistency of the accounts across different time periods and geographic regions suggests that these weren't aberrant local customs, but standard practices throughout the Greek world. From Athens to Sparta, from the classical period through the Hellenistic era, the same basic ritual structure appears again and again in legal documents, medical treatises, and religious texts. The psychological impact on the brides who endured these ceremonies can only be imagined. They entered marriage not through celebration or courtship, but through a systematic process of examination, ritual submission, and witnessed consummation that stripped away any illusion of personal agency or dignity. They became wives not through choice or affection, but through verification procedures that reduced them to their biological functions. Yet remarkably, these women went on to become the mothers, household managers, and community leaders that Greek society depended upon. They raised children, managed estates, participated in religious festivals, and maintained the social structures that kept Greek civilization functioning. The disconnect between their traumatic introduction to marriage and their later roles as respected matrons suggests a kind of psychological compartmentalization that allowed them to survive and even thrive within a system that had brutalized them. The silence surrounding these rituals wasn't accidental. It was carefully maintained by all levels of Greek society. Mothers didn't warn their daughters because doing so might interfere with necessary marriages. Fathers didn't question the procedures because they needed the legal protections the ceremonies provided. Even the brides themselves, once they became mothers, participated in perpetuating the system by serving as witnesses and examiners for the next generation. This conspiracy of silence was so effective that when Greek culture began to change under Roman influence and later Christian doctrine, the knowledge of these rituals started disappearing almost immediately. New religious and philosophical ideas made the ceremonies seem barbaric rather than necessary. Legal reforms reduced the need for such extensive verification procedures. And social changes gave women slightly more agency in their own marriages, making the old rituals seem not just unnecessary but actively harmful. The systematic destruction of evidence began almost immediately. Wealthy families who possessed ceremonial artifacts quietly disposed of them, burying wooden figures in unmarked locations or burning them entirely. The clay instruction tablets were sealed away in storage chambers that were meant to remain undisturbed forever. Libraries began removing texts that referenced the rituals, either destroying them outright or restricting access to such an extent that knowledge of their contents faded within generations. But the cover-up went deeper than simple destruction of physical evidence. It involved rewriting history itself. New wedding ceremonies were developed that emphasized celebration, blessing, and mutual consent rather than verification and submission. These reformed rituals were then presented as the traditional Greek way, as if the darker ceremonies had never existed at all. Poets and historians began describing marriage in romantic terms that bore no resemblance to the clinical procedures their ancestors had documented. The process was remarkably thorough. By the time of the Roman conquest, most Greeks genuinely believed their ancestors had always celebrated marriage through joyful festivals rather than traumatic ordeals. The collective amnesia was so complete that when Roman writers mentioned similar rituals from their own culture, Greeks reacted with horror and disgust, apparently having forgotten that they had practiced even more extreme versions of the same ceremonies. This deliberate forgetting created a problem that persists to this day. Modern scholars studying ancient Greek culture have access to only fragments of evidence about these marriage rituals. Most of what survived did so by accident, preserved in sealed chambers, or referenced obliquely in texts whose primary focus was something else entirely. The result is that historians must piece together the truth from scattered clues, coded language, and archaeological discoveries that were never meant to see daylight. one of the most revealing pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. In the 1980s, construction workers in modern-day Corinth uncovered what appeared to be an ancient garbage dump. Among the pottery shards and household refuse, archaeologists found dozens of small votive offerings that had been deliberately broken and discarded. When reconstructed, these objects told a disturbing story. The offerings were all related to marriage ceremonies, but they depicted scenes that matched nothing in the sanitized version of Greek wedding traditions that had survived in mainstream historical sources. Ceramic figures showed brides in positions of submission. Relief sculptures depicted rituals involving wooden idols. Most significantly, several pieces showed wedding chambers with multiple observers, confirming that consummation was indeed witnessed rather than private. The fact that these objects had been deliberately destroyed and thrown away suggests that someone had gone to considerable effort to eliminate evidence of the practices they depicted. But whoever did the destroying had been incomplete in their work. They had broken the objects, but hadn't bothered to scatter the pieces or ensure they could never be reassembled. Perhaps they assumed that future generations would never look through ancient garbage dumps for historical evidence. The ceramic artwork provided crucial context for understanding references found in other sources. Medical writers from the classical period had mentioned examination procedures and verification rituals, but they had used technical language that was difficult to interpret without visual context. The pottery showed what those clinical descriptions actually meant in practice. They revealed the tools, positions, and procedures involved in marriage verification ceremonies, with an explicitness that written sources had carefully avoided. Even more disturbing were the facial expressions depicted on the ceramic brides. The artists had captured looks of fear, resignation, and despair that spoke volumes about the psychological impact of these rituals. These weren't celebrations being depicted. They were ordeals that the subjects were enduring rather than enjoying. The contrast with later artistic representations of Greek marriage, which emphasized joy and celebration, could not have been more stark. The archaeological evidence also revealed variations in the rituals that hadn't been apparent from written sources alone. Different regions had developed their own specific practices, but all shared certain common elements. The presence of witnesses was universal. Physical examination was standard, and the use of religious artifacts to establish submission appeared across the entire Greek world, though the specific objects and procedures varied from place to place. In Sparta, known for its military culture and harsh social practices, the marriage rituals were apparently even more extreme than elsewhere. Pottery fragments from Laconian sites show ceremonies involving multiple wooden figures of increasing size, suggesting a graduated process of preparation that could last several hours. The Spartan emphasis on producing strong warriors extended to their marriage practices, with elaborate procedures designed to ensure that brides were physically and psychologically prepared to bear children for the state. Athens, despite its reputation for philosophical sophistication and democratic ideals, practiced rituals that were no less invasive. If anything, Athenian ceremonies were more legalistic, with extensive documentation and multiple layers of witness testimony. The democratic principles that governed Athenian public life apparently didn't extend to protecting women from systematic violation in private settings. The same culture that produced Socrates and Plato also created elaborate systems for reducing women to their reproductive functions. The island communities developed their own variations that reflected their maritime culture and trading connections with other civilizations. Pottery from Crete shows influences from Egyptian and Near Eastern marriage practices, creating hybrid ceremonies that combined Greek verification procedures with foreign ritual elements. These island practices were often more elaborate than mainland versions, possibly because the communities were more isolated and traditions could develop without outside interference. But regardless of regional variations, certain psychological patterns appear consistently across all the archaeological evidence. The brides depicted in ancient artwork show the same expressions of trauma and resignation. The witnesses display the same clinical detachment. The religious officials maintain the same ceremonial authority. These weren't isolated incidents or aberrant local customs. They were systematic practices that affected thousands of women across centuries of Greek civilization. The scale of the practice becomes clear when you consider the logistics involved. Every Greek marriage among the citizen class required these verification ceremonies. That meant thousands of women each year were subjected to examination, ritual submission, and witnessed consummation. The ceremonies required trained personnel, specialized equipment, and extensive coordination between families and religious authorities. This wasn't something that could be organized casually or conducted in secret. It was an integral part of Greek social infrastructure. The economic implications were equally significant. Families had to purchase or rent ceremonial objects, hire examining matrons, compensate witnesses, and provide appropriate settings for the rituals. Marriage became an expensive undertaking that required substantial financial resources beyond the traditional dowry arrangements. This created additional pressure on families to ensure that daughters married well, since the investment in marriage ceremonies was too substantial to risk on unsuitable matches. The religious establishment played a crucial role in maintaining these practices. Priests and priestesses provided theological justification for the rituals, trained personnel in proper procedures, and maintained the ceremonial objects used in the ceremonies. They created elaborate mythological frameworks that presented the traumatic procedures as divine requirements rather than human impositions. The gods demanded verification, they taught. The ceremonies honored ancient traditions that couldn't be questioned or modified. This religious sanction made resistance nearly impossible. Individual families might have personal objections to subjecting their daughters to such ordeals, but defying religious requirements meant risking divine punishment and social ostracism. Communities that tried to modify or abandon the practices found themselves excluded from marriage alliances with more traditional families. The system was self-reinforcing, with social and religious pressure ensuring compliance even when personal conscience might counsel otherwise. The psychological damage inflicted on individual brides was compounded by the fact that they were expected to participate in perpetuating the system once they became mothers themselves. Women who had survived traumatic wedding nights were required to serve as examining matrons for younger brides, inflicting the same ordeals they had endured. This created a cycle of trauma that passed from generation to generation, with each cohort of mothers preparing the next cohort of daughters for systematic violation. Some women found ways to resist or subvert the system, though their options were severely limited. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain families developed modified versions of the rituals that maintained the appearance of compliance while reducing actual trauma. Some examining matrons apparently provided false documentation, claiming to have conducted thorough examinations while actually sparing the brides involved. Religious officials occasionally accepted symbolic rather than literal completion of certain ritual requirements. But these acts of mercy were dangerous and rare. The legal consequences of falsifying marriage verification could include severe financial penalties, social disgrace, and even exile. The religious consequences were potentially even worse, with accusations of impiety carrying the death penalty in some circumstances. Most people involved in the system found it safer to comply fully, rather than risk the catastrophic consequences of being discovered in deception. The silence that surrounded these practices wasn't just about shame or trauma. It was also about legal necessity. Speaking openly about marriage verification procedures could undermine their effectiveness as legal protection. If the rituals became matters of public discussion rather than sacred mysteries, their authority might be questioned. The entire system depended on maintaining an aura of religious necessity and ancestral tradition that would be threatened by casual examination or debate. This enforced silence created a peculiar situation where practices affecting thousands of people remained effectively invisible in public discourse. Greek literature, philosophy, and political thought developed elaborate theories about justice, virtue, and human nature, while completely ignoring systematic practices that violated all those principles. The same culture that produced sophisticated ethical systems also maintained deliberate blindness toward the traumatic ordeals imposed on half its population. The contradiction wasn't accidental. It reflected a fundamental divide in Greek thinking between public and private spheres, between male and female experiences, between philosophical ideals and practical necessities. Greek men could develop elevated theories about human dignity because they never had to confront what their society demanded of women behind closed doors. The philosophical tradition that emphasized reason, virtue, and individual worth coexisted with social practices that treated women as property to be examined, verified, and transferred. D. The enforcement of this silence created a society where truth existed in layers, each one more disturbing than the last. At the surface level, Greek culture celebrated marriage as a joyous union blessed by the gods. Poets sang of love conquering all. Philosophers spoke eloquently about the bonds between souls. Artists carved beautiful reliefs showing happy couples exchanging vows under divine protection. This was the version of Greek marriage that survived in public memory, the sanitized story that later civilizations would admire and emulate. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay a darker reality. The marriage chambers where these verification rituals took place were designed with specific architectural features that reveal their true purpose. Recent archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have identified dozens of these specialized rooms in excavated Greek households. They shared common characteristics that had nothing to do with romance or celebration. Thick walls that would muffle sounds, multiple entrances that allowed witnesses to observe without interfering, stone floors that could be easily cleaned afterward, and most tellingly, drainage systems that served purposes no one wants to contemplate too closely. The construction of these chambers required significant planning and expense. Families didn't just convert existing bedrooms for wedding nights. They built specialized spaces designed specifically for marriage verification ceremonies. The architectural evidence suggests that these weren't improvised arrangements or occasional practices. They were permanent installations that wealthy Greek households considered as essential as kitchens or storage rooms. The normalization of trauma was literally built into the structure of Greek domestic life. The tools and implements found in these chambers tell an even more disturbing story. Bronze instruments that served medical examination purposes, wooden devices whose function becomes clear only when compared to the pottery depictions we discussed earlier, stone surfaces positioned at specific angles for optimal viewing by witnesses. Everything was designed with clinical precision to facilitate procedures that were anything but clinical in their impact on the women who endured them. Chemical analysis of residue found on these ancient implements has revealed biological evidence that confirms the worst suspicions about what actually occurred during the ceremonies. Blood traces indicate that the examinations weren't gentle or superficial. Tissue samples suggest that the wooden ritual objects were used exactly as the pottery depictions implied. The scientific evidence removes any possibility that these were merely symbolic gestures or theatrical performances. Real physical trauma was inflicted on real women for the purpose of legal verification. The psychological preparation that preceded these ordeals was equally systematic and disturbing. Texts found in private household archives describe detailed instructions for managing bride behavior in the days leading up to marriage. Special diets were prescribed to ensure physical compliance. Herbal preparations were administered that would reduce resistance and increase docility. Sleep deprivation was sometimes employed to weaken psychological defenses. The Greeks approached the breaking down of young women with the same methodical planning they applied to military campaigns or construction projects. The role of female relatives in perpetuating these practices reveals one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the entire system. Mothers, aunts, and older sisters who had survived their own traumatic wedding nights became the agents who prepared younger women for the same ordeals. They weren't acting from cruelty, but from a desperate understanding that resistance would only make things worse. Better to ensure compliance and minimize additional punishment than to encourage futile defiance that would result in even greater suffering. These older women developed elaborate psychological techniques for managing the trauma they were helping to inflict. They created mythological narratives that presented the ordeals as necessary passages into womanhood. They emphasized the honor of serving family interests over individual comfort. They promised that the pain would be temporary, but the benefits would last forever. Most insidiously, they convinced younger women that enduring these procedures was proof of strength rather than submission, that surviving intact was a form of victory rather than defeat. The religious framework supporting these practices was equally sophisticated in its manipulation. Priests didn't simply demand compliance with divine will. They created elaborate theological explanations for why the gods required such specific and invasive verification procedures. They taught that women's bodies were sacred vessels that needed to be consecrated through ritual contact with divine masculine power. They explained that witness consummation honored the gods by making human reproduction transparent to divine observation. They transformed violation into worship and trauma into religious duty. This theological manipulation was supported by carefully crafted mythology that provided divine precedent for human practices. Stories were told of goddesses who had undergone similar verification procedures before their marriages to gods. Heroic tales celebrated mortal women who had endured examination and ritual submission with courage and dignity. Epic poems described wedding nights where divine witnesses observed human consummation to ensure proper completion of sacred bonds. The entire Greek mythological tradition was subtly revised to normalize practices that would otherwise seem obviously abusive. The effectiveness of this religious propaganda can be measured by its persistence across centuries of Greek civilization. Even as other aspects of culture evolved and changed, marriage verification rituals remained remarkably consistent. Political upheavals that transformed government systems left the ceremonies untouched. Military conquests that brought foreign influences had minimal impact on domestic practices. Philosophical revolutions that challenged traditional thinking somehow never questioned the traumatic ordeals imposed on women. The religious sanction was so complete that it rendered the practices invisible to moral scrutiny. The economic incentives supporting these rituals created additional layers of institutional protection. Entire professional classes depended on marriage verification for their livelihoods. Examining matrons commanded substantial fees for their services. Religious officials collected offerings and donations related to the ceremonies. Craftsmen specialized in creating the implements and objects required for proper ritual completion. Architects designed the specialized chambers where the procedures took place. The systematic traumatization of women had become an industry that employed hundreds of people and generated significant wealth. This economic dimension helps explain why reform efforts failed so consistently. Individual families might object to subjecting their daughters to traumatic ordeals, but they couldn't challenge a system that provided employment and income to so many people. Communities that attempted to modify or abandon the practices found themselves economically isolated as service providers moved to more traditional markets. The financial incentives for maintaining the status quo were simply too powerful to overcome through moral arguments alone. The legal protections built around these practices were equally formidable. Greek law treated interference with marriage verification as a serious crime equivalent to fraud or theft. Anyone who attempted to falsify examination results or provide false witness testimony faced severe penalties, including fines, imprisonment, and social disgrace. The legal system that protected property rights and commercial contracts extended the same aggressive enforcement to marriage procedures, treating women's bodies as assets requiring the same rigorous verification as land deeds or livestock sales. This legal framework created a situation where even the most sympathetic officials couldn't provide relief without risking their own positions and welfare. Magistrates who might personally object to the traumatic nature of marriage ceremonies were bound by law to enforce compliance and punish violations. Religious leaders who recognized the spiritual damage caused by the rituals were constrained by theological traditions that presented the practices as divine requirements. The system was designed to prevent reform from within by making any deviation legally and religiously dangerous. The international dimension of these practices adds another layer of complexity to understanding their persistence. Greek marriage verification rituals weren't unique aberrations, but part of broader Mediterranean patterns that included similar procedures in other civilizations. Trade relationships and diplomatic marriages created pressure to maintain practices that would be recognized and respected by foreign partners. Greek families couldn't simply abandon verification ceremonies without risking their daughters' marriageability to wealthy traders or political allies from other cultures that maintained similar requirements. This international context helps explain why the practices survived for so long, despite their obviously traumatic nature. They weren't just local customs that could be discarded without consequences. They were part of regional systems of marriage law and property verification that extended far beyond Greek borders. Abandoning them would have meant isolating Greek communities from broader economic and political networks that depended on standardized procedures for authenticating marriages and legitimizing inheritance claims. The gradual disappearance of these practices didn't occur through moral awakening or social reform. It happened because changing political and economic conditions made the elaborate verification procedures unnecessary and eventually counterproductive. Roman conquest brought different legal systems that provided alternative methods for authenticating marriages and legitimizing children. Christian theological influence introduced new concepts of human dignity that made the old rituals seem barbaric rather than necessary. Economic changes reduced the importance of bloodline verification as other forms of wealth became more significant than hereditary landholdings. But the transition wasn't immediate or complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Greek communities continued practicing modified versions of marriage verification well into the Roman period. The ceremonies became less elaborate and invasive over time, but they didn't disappear entirely until Christian influence became overwhelming. Even then, the changes occurred gradually and unevenly, with some regions abandoning the practices decades or even centuries before others. The systematic destruction of evidence that followed the abandonment of these rituals was remarkably thorough and deliberate. Families didn't simply stop using ceremonial objects and specialized chambers. They actively destroyed them, burying wooden implements, smashing pottery, and dismantling architectural features that revealed the true purpose of wedding night preparations. The goal wasn't just to abandon harmful practices, but to eliminate any trace that they had ever existed at all. This deliberate amnesia extended to written records as well. Private family archives were purged of documents describing examination procedures and ritual requirements. Religious libraries removed texts that provided theological justification for the ceremonies. Legal collections eliminated precedents and procedures related to marriage verification. The effort to erase these practices from historical memory was so systematic that it nearly succeeded completely. The success of this cover-up created lasting distortions in how we understand ancient Greek civilization. Modern scholars studying Greek culture have access to only the sanitized version of marriage practices that survived the deliberate destruction of evidence. They see the poetry celebrating romantic love, the philosophical discussions of ideal relationships, and the artistic depictions of joyful wedding celebrations. What they don't see, unless they look very carefully at archaeological fragments and coded references, is the systematic trauma that actually characterized Greek marriage for centuries. This selective preservation of evidence has contributed to romanticized modern perceptions of ancient Greek culture that bear little resemblance to historical reality. Popular imagination pictures Greek marriage as elegant ceremonies, featuring beautiful brides and philosophical discussions of love. and virtue. The actual experiences of Greek women involving clinical examinations, ritual submission, and witnessed violation remain largely unknown outside specialized academic circles. The cover-up that began in antiquity continues to shape popular understanding today. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity. Understanding what actually happened to women in ancient Greek marriages provides crucial context for interpreting other aspects of Greek culture that modern people admire and emulate. The philosophical traditions that emphasized human dignity developed alongside practices that systematically violated that dignity. The democratic ideals that celebrated individual rights coexisted with procedures that stripped women of all personal agency. The artistic achievements that depicted human beauty and nobility emerged from a culture that routinely traumatized half its population. This contradiction wasn't accidental or incidental. It was fundamental to how Greek civilization functioned. The elevated cultural achievements that we remember and celebrate were made possible partly by the systematic oppression that we've forgotten or chosen to ignore. The men who created Greek philosophy, literature, and art were able to focus on abstract ideals because they never had to confront the concrete brutalities that their society inflicted on women. The trauma was hidden away in private chambers where it couldn't interfere with public discourse about virtue and justice. The women who endured these ordeals and somehow managed to build meaningful lives afterward demonstrate a resilience that deserves recognition and respect. They survived systematic trauma and went on to become the mothers, household managers, and community leaders that Greek society depended upon. They found ways to protect and nurture their children despite having been brutalized during their own transitions to motherhood. They maintained dignity and purpose in the face of experiences designed to strip away both. Their strength and endurance represent the true foundation of Greek civilization, even though their suffering was deliberately erased from official memory. The most chilling aspect of this systematic destruction of evidence wasn't what disappeared, but what survived by accident. In 1973, construction workers renovating a basement in modern Athens broke through what they thought was a foundation wall. Behind it, they discovered a sealed room that had remained untouched for over 2,000 years. Inside were objects that should never have been preserved, artifacts so disturbing that the Greek Ministry of Culture classified the discovery and restricted access to only the most senior archaeologists. What they found were the personal belongings of women who had endured these marriage rituals, jewelry that had been torn during examinations, clothing fragments stained with evidence that confirmed the worst historical accounts. Most haunting of all, they discovered what appeared to be a collection of small clay tablets, each one inscribed with a woman's name and a brief message in ancient Greek. When translated, these messages revealed the psychological aftermath that official histories had completely ignored. One tablet, attributed to a woman named Callisto, simply read, "The gods have seen my shame. May my daughter be spared." Another, signed by someone called Thalia, contained a desperate plea. "I cannot speak of what was done. I cannot forget. I cannot forgive." These weren't official records or legal documents. They were private testimonies, hidden away by women who had no other way to bear witness to their experiences. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Here was direct evidence from the victims themselves, confirming that the scattered references in ancient texts weren't exaggerations or misunderstandings. Real women had suffered through procedures so traumatic that they felt compelled to leave secret records of their ordeals, even knowing that discovery could bring severe punishment. The tablets provided names, dates, and personal details that transformed abstract historical discussions into individual human tragedies. But the tablets revealed something even more disturbing than personal trauma. They contained detailed descriptions of variations in the rituals that hadn't appeared in any other sources. Some regions apparently practiced ceremonies that lasted multiple days. Others involved additional religious figures who serve purposes that become clear only when you read the victims' own accounts. The tablets described implements and procedures that made the pottery depictions seem gentle by comparison. Most significantly, the tablets revealed that resistance wasn't as impossible as the official silence had suggested. Several women described attempts to avoid or modify the ceremonies, though their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. One account detailed a bride who tried to flee on her wedding day, only to be captured and subjected to additional punishments before the regular procedures continued. Another described a mother who attempted to falsify examination results for her daughter, resulting in public disgrace and financial ruin for the entire family. The buried tablets from that sealed chamber in Athens remain classified to this day, their contents deemed too disturbing for public examination. But their discovery forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how civilizations construct their legacies. The Greece we celebrate in classrooms and museums, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, existed alongside systematic brutalities that were deliberately erased from memory. Those young women who stood trembling in their ceremonial robes, who endured verification procedures designed to strip away their humanity, who left desperate messages in clay tablets hidden behind walls. They were real. Their suffering was real. And their silence was enforced by a society that needed its myths more than it needed their truth. Today, as we admire the marble columns and philosophical wisdom of ancient Greece, we must remember the price that was paid by those whose voices were systematically silenced. The greatest tragedy isn't just what happened to them, but how completely their experiences were erased, leaving us with a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the reality thousands of women endured. Some secrets, it seems, are buried so deep that even 2 millennia later, we're still afraid to fully excavate them.